I'd like to just briefly provide a short, very brief little introduction on the conceptual level that helps us to frame our conversation today and why this is such a pressing issue. We know, there we go. Why this topic particular? There was recently the UN report coming out, which really crunches down and condensed the issue, and particular pointed out some of these pressing facts. The first one is we know 1 billion people around the planet live in informal settlements or in slums or favelas in very overcrowded and inadequate housing. They are most impacted by the virus because of these circumstances. We do know also more than 95% of these cases happen in urban areas, and in total 2.4 billion people lack adequate access to safe water and sanitation in those communities. Yes, it is an urban issue, and already over 1,430 cities and 210 countries are affected by COVID-19, so pretty much all countries on the world. So often what we know, those people which originally moved from rural areas to cities in hope for better urban lives and having their dream realized to a more healthier and fulfilled life often remains a dream. So therefore often the vision of having higher livability is really in the far distant future. So particular coming back to public space, there's a really strong link for our discourse in relation to the Sustainable Development Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, but particular the sub-target 11.7, in which we're by 2030, we seek to provide universal access to safe, inclusive, accessible and green public spaces. So we know there's a plethora of different challenges coming towards us, which are directly threat to the health and well-being of those vulnerable community members which live in these communities. So they range from the lack of the voice in the community, lack of access to education, lack of employment opportunities, social exclusion, spatially as well as in the decision-making processes, exposure to poor housing conditions, poor access to fresh water, sanitation, as I mentioned briefly earlier, gender-based violence, early pregnancy, no access to health service, drug and alcohol abuse, criminal activities, and particular overcrowding during the COVID-19 pandemic is also a real challenge. So with these in mind, I just like to draw your attention to some of my own conceptual angle to that, because I've been privileged enough to work with Dreamtown in Sierra Leone on subjective well-being and public space intervention. So I just briefly put in what do we mean by subjective well-being. That is really a person that reports on their cognitive and affective evaluation of his or her own life. So with that in mind, we can actually understand and delve into the lived experience of those people to really understand what's going on. And that brings me to also some of our speakers will touch on that we really tackling this human-centered design approach foremost from the bottom up as part of this webinar today. And on the conceptual level, I'd like to introduce you, maybe some of you have heard of that before, but the dialectic between space on the one hand and then the concept of urban lovability on the other, because it is something complex and also not so easy to grasp. So please follow me on this chart ahead in front of you, this graph. So on the one side, we know people and spaces, they are informed, they have different, people play different roles, have different responsibilities in these communities, their needs have to be met and their perception is different. So it very much comes down to the human experience and is very directly linked to their subjective well-being. Yet together, we know people individually as well as collectively, we do create spaces, and we do know a space is more than just a physical place. Yeah. And there is this relationship always going on between the space and the physicality, the materiality, which is a place. both is being conditioned and shapes itself vice versa, and then also leaves a big impact on the people. So this concept of urban lovability, you can really hypothesize with this kind of concept that we really create context-specific conditions in which, with people, in which the possibility to embrace urban lovability can be transformed in their environment as well as their well-being. So spaces, in essence, are literally socially produced. So with that in mind, the work what we've done in Sierra Leone, we found really nurturing ground there. And the image in the middle that's what we found after Ebola hit the country. They had this and the civil war and all this. They started this campaign, Sierra Leoneans say no to hate speeches. So it's all about agape, bringing out this compassionate affection towards another, to really lift the collective spirit in the country, to find a way of how they can break the cycle. Particularly with our intervention, we targeted and created spaces which are first coming through the people to empower them through education and through dreaming processes, how they can break that cycle. And at the same time, we were eager to measure their level of subjective well-being. So there are 2 resources out there which we have published on that, in case you're interested. So what does really urban lovability mean then? So it's a positive and voluntary intrinsic feeling or compassionate affection turned into an actuality. It uplifts the individual as well as the collective human spirit as part of our everyday life. And it offers an inclusive approach to our collective state of human existence. This all in total can improve our subjective well-being with a sense of immediacy. So this is very much more than creating big infrastructure which delivers higher livability, because often that is really this far-reaching goal which most of the people which living in these communities are hardly able to reach. So by linking this everyday life experience, this concept of urban lovability and the collective human existence becomes meaningful. And then how do we measure something so intangible? I mean, and there's certain ways which you can bring together to get really an understanding and perhaps shift the paradigm to a much more holistic view of what's going on. So on one hand, and I'm not going into that much in detail, is the social capital, which you can actually measure and see in communities. On the other hand, then there is this collective efficacy that is about the ability to mobilize and undertake collective action. Very important when you link it to empowerment and education, and you can really shift social norms and break through stigma. Particularly during the times of COVID-19, we very much facing the stigma again, and we have to really be mindful of what kind of future we wish to co-create. Subjective well-being is a very powerful tool to measure that well-being of an individual and then aggregate it up to a higher level to really see what are the pressing points, where do we can put our energy in to really drive some real change within communities on public health level. And then, of course, space intervention. We know all the wonderful placemaking initiatives which are happening around the globe, but more though also it is a way of how we modify materiality. And this includes all sorts of structures which cater for health and well-being of those people which live in these communities, including social infrastructure and so on. So